But let's get into the story here in reference to Glenn Greenwald. Now, first of all, if you are not following Glenn Greenwald on Rumble, his show is called System Update. What he typically tends to do is he'll have the full show on Rumble, but then he'll take a clip from it and post it on YouTube. I highly recommend you follow him on Rumble. If you're not watching this show, you are missing out. He is killing it over there. And in this particular discussion, he talks about how war and poverty are connected. And he says some really powerful things here. And he even brings back a little bit of history to show you that this has actually been taught to us before. Most of us watching or around probably were not alive back then, but some of you probably were. So if you don't remember, this is going to refresh your memory. But what does Glenn Greenwald say about the connection between war and poverty? Let's get into it.
It has long been recognized for decades as a staple, not just of left liberal politics, but our politics in general, that of course we sacrifice and suffer as American citizens when we allow our government to spend endless sums of money on foreign wars. Of course, those are inextricably linked. And there's a lot of people who have made this point over the years, and I think the most compelling case was made by Martin Luther King in a speech he delivered in Riverside Church in New York on April 4th, 1967, 1 year to the date before he was assassinated in 1968. The purpose of the speech, well, it was called Beyond Vietnam, a Time to Break Silence. Beyond Vietnam, a Time to Break Silence. And the purpose of this speech was for Martin Luther King to come forward and explain why he had recently begun spending so much time opposing the war in Vietnam, whereas prior to that, he had basically abstained from any foreign policy or war debates on the grounds that he only wanted to focus on his domestic agenda, on his domestic goals, which were not just about racial equality, but eliminating deprivation and poverty across a multiracial coalition.
A lot of times when mainstream media pundits discuss Martin Luther King, especially on his birthday, they bring up his domestic ideas, right? The policies that he thought this country should pass in reference to the American people. You don't hear them talk about how Martin Luther King felt about foreign policy. And there's a reason for that. And it's not just that. You don't hear them talk about the fact that Martin Luther King was anti-capitalist. You don't hear them talk about the fact that Martin Luther King actually started to call for a UBI, a universal basic income. You don't hear them talk about those things. And if you look in school history books, they don't mention that either. And there's a reason for that. They do not want the American people to get those ideas again, even though it is making more news, thanks to people like Andrew Yang, etc. But they don't want the American people to start getting ideas. So what they do is they whitewash history. So listen to what MLK said in reference to these wars and poverty and how it's connected.
That was always his stated goal, not just racial, but economic and class. And so he came to give this speech as a way of essentially apologizing for the fact that he neglected the war in Vietnam and other issues of war and militarism for so long, because he came to understand that the two cannot be separated.
That's right.
That the reason so many Americans and American cities are in decay and neglect, and people are suffering in the working class, not nearly as much as they are now, but certainly then they were as well, is because of how much resources we allow our government to devote to hundreds of military bases, to endless wars all over the world that never improves the life of American citizens. So let's just take a moment to look at what he said, because as I say, it is, I think, the most compelling case for why these two debates, the issue of militarism over here and the lives of American citizens over here, are actually completely interconnected.
This is exactly why I say that domestic policy and foreign policy are both important. Foreign policy is domestic policy in a sense. And this is an example I can point to prove that. because it is connected. We have to start thinking from a global perspective. Even when we talk about the issues that are happening in our country, we have to look at it globally and how it's all connected. And this is true. Our government has a defense budget right now, and it wasn't as high back then, but right now the defense budget is over $800 billion. That's money that could be allocated towards other programs and resources to help American people. But as long as you have a bloated military budget, and you have politicians in DC that support it, and you have a Wall Street that supports the military industrial complex, and you have billionaires like Elon Musk who also support the military industrial complex, nothing will ever change. This is especially crucial. You have to understand that what was happening in Vietnam back then was an American issue. It was not just a problem in Vietnam. Let's go on.
And you can't separate them that way by saying, oh yeah, I support the war in Ukraine and I want to keep sending in unlimited resources because that has nothing to do with the lives of American citizens. It's the resources of our government and how we use them. That's what the debate is about. This is what he said, quote, I come to this magnificent house of worship tonight because my conscience leaves me no choice. I join with you in this meeting because I am in deepest agreement with the aims and work of the organization which has brought us together. Clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam. That was the group that asked him to speak. The recent statement of your executive committee are the sentiments of my own heart, and I found myself in full accord when I read its opening lines. Quote, a time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us in relation to Vietnam. Over the past 2 years, as I have moved to break the betrayal of my own silences, and to speak from the burnings of my own heart, as I have called for radical departures from the destruction of Vietnam, many persons have questioned me about the wisdom of my path. At the heart of their concerns, this query has often loomed large and loud. Quote, why are you speaking about war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. Aren't you hurting the cause of your people, they ask? And when I hear them, though I often understand the source of their concern, I am nevertheless greatly saddened. For such questions mean that the inquirers have not really known me, my commitment, or my calling. Indeed, their questions suggest that they do not know the world in which they live. Nor is it an attempt to overlook the ambiguity of the total situation and the need for a collective solution to the tragedy of Vietnam. Neither is it an attempt to make North Vietnam or the National Liberation Front paragons of virtue, nor to overlook the role they can play in a successful resolution of the problem.
Let's jump in here for just a second. The comment that was made by Martin Luther King commenting on the war in Vietnam, isn't this going to hurt the efforts for his people? They mean African-American people. No. And you have to remember the Vietnam War had the draft. And that draft affected everybody in this country who was male and of age to be drafted, and every man in this country that was not from a wealthy family. Rich people found ways to get their kids out of participating in the draft. Some people ran off to Canada. This is back when you didn't need a passport to travel to Canada. But for the average working class American, if you had a son who was of age to be drafted, 9 times out of 10, you were affected in some way, shape, or form. And that includes African Americans as well. So for the people who said that to Dr. King, isn't this going to hurt your community? How would him addressing this hurt the African American community when they were also participating in the draft? This is something I want you to ask yourself.
While they both may have justifiable reasons to be suspicious of the good faith of the United States, life and history give eloquent testimony to the fact that conflicts are never resolved without trustful give and take on both sides. Tonight, however, I wish not to speak with Hanoi or the NLF, but rather to my fellow Americans who, with me, bear the greatest responsibility in ending a conflict that has exacted a heavy price on both continents. And here's his argument as to why he believes it's not just consistent with his domestic agenda and his causes, but necessary to them. Quote, since I am a preacher by trade, I suppose it is not surprising that I have 7 major reasons for bringing Vietnam into the field of my moral vision. There is at the outset a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. Now listen to how he defines his cause. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. There were experiments, hopes, new beginnings. Then came the buildup in Vietnam, the military buildup, and I watched the program be broken and eviscerated as if it were some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor so long as adventures like Vietnam continue to draw men and skills and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube.
This piece right here, I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor so long as adventures like Vietnam continue to draw men and skills and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. Even back then, Martin Luther King was calling out the money, the corporate powers that be, the money that is the MIC. And like I said, the defense budget was nowhere near as high back then as it is now. But even then, he saw it. He saw the problem. Why do you think people like Dr. King, people like Malcolm X, people like Fred Hampton, why do you think they knew early on that who they voted for was not going to fix the wealth inequalities in this country? They had already lived it. They knew this wasn't going to change anything. That's why they decided to help people in their own communities. That's why they took it to the streets, because they knew that the US government, that the politicians were not going to do it willingly. They knew that they had to fight for it. Fred Hampton and the Black Panthers, they knew this. This is why they built their own clinics. This is why they started the free breakfast program for kids in their community. This is why they did mutual aid, because they knew the government was not going to look out for the people. And I say this because even today, based on the history, you would think more Americans would be aware of that. But most Americans that I've met are not aware of it. Most Americans that I've met, they don't even know what the Black Panthers really were. They only know what they were told in school. And in my history book, I don't know about yours, but they did not have a good depiction of the Black Panthers. People have become so focused on who they vote for to solve their problems instead of figuring out how they can come together as a community to solve their problems. Instead of actually looking at what Dr. King said, Dr. King warned you. He warned you, this is back then, that they were never going to help. They were never going to help the people as long as the military-industrial complex was in place.
So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such. Meaning, of course, if we're spending enormous sums of money on wars abroad, it's going to have a gigantic impact on the lives of American citizens, particularly the ones whose lives have not been elevated to being very wealthy or to the upper class, namely the poor and working classes of all races. That was his argument. Now, here we just want to play you an audio of one segment of this speech where he gives a very emphatic critique of the United States' posture in the world, something that if you were to say now would prompt accusations that you were some sort of Kremlin agent or America hater. And of course, that was said about him as well, not necessarily for this reason though. So listen to this passage in the speech where he connects war policy and what he has come to regard as the U.S. role in the world.
Listen to this.
My third reason moves to an even deeper level of awareness, for it grows out of my experience in the ghettos of the North over the last 3 years, especially the last 3 summers. As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action.
You won't hear this speech in a classroom in this country today for the most part. unless you have a teacher that's a little bit righteous, so to speak.
But they asked, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They asked if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problem, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government.
My own government. The greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own government. Because the United States government has been intervening in countries. We showed this list on here a couple months ago. I think this goes all the way back to the 1800s. Could be even further than that. I have to go back and check, but they have been doing this for so long. And you can't sit up here and criticize the way that someone like Malcolm X chose to protest. Now, Martin Luther King had a nonviolent approach. Malcolm X had, it was just like, fuck it. Why are we being nonviolent? They're not being nonviolent towards us. So they disagreed there. Although MLK did change his mind towards the end of his life, he wondered if that was actually the right idea to be nonviolent. But for the people who pushed back against the protesters who chose to go that route, said, we're going to have to push back here physically. How can you say that and then you're okay with the U.S. government committing violence upon people in all these countries all over the world? The U.S. government has over 700 military bases in the world. We're the only country that have that many. That's around all these countries. We're not there to protect them. We're there to watch them. And you have to understand that. Let's go on.
For the sake of those boys, for the sake of this government, for the sake of the hundreds of thousands trembling under our violence, I cannot be silent.
Yep. So there's a couple notable aspects of that passage. One is he, again, is saying throughout this entire speech that if you spend resources on endless war, of course that's going to affect the society in all sorts of negative ways, namely the ability of American citizens at home of all races to live a decent quality of life. He also, interestingly, connects the fact that if you're a country at endless war, constantly sending guns and arms and bombs and using them around the world, it's going to degrade your national character as well, in the sense that it's very difficult to tell people that violence isn't the answer to their problems if they constantly see their own government, as he called the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government, using violence in every other country as a way of solving problems. But his key argument was this emphasis on resources and the fact that there was no way he could ever succeed in building a country with better lives for all Americans if he simply ignored the resource drain that came from America's posture of endless wars.
That piece right there. The name of this speech is called Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. That was April 4th, 1967, 1 year before he was assassinated. So you have to understand, when we talk about the poverty issue in this country, it is not that our government doesn't have the money. They have plenty of money. But how they allocate the money is the issue. And they choose to have a bloated defense budget because it is more important to them to have these never-ending wars because they're profitable. And the military industrial complex is connected to Wall Street. You have to understand that. And then two, it is more profitable for them to, abstract resources from these countries, to leave the people there in despair, just so that they have oil, so that they have resources like opium. People forget this, but there was opium in Afghanistan. Look at what the U.S. government has done to countries like Haiti. There's a reason why when people say Haiti is so poor, not in resources. So In order to fix the poverty issue in this country, you first have to address how is the money that we have spent. And then after you address that, then you have to look at how little is given to social programs in the American people and how much is given to the defense budget, the military industrial complex. And then you'll understand why we don't have health care for people in this country. Then you have to look at the corporate powers that be that are also in the mix. When you look at big pharma, when you look at companies like Lockheed Martin and they have their hand and their lobbyists in our government, then you understand why they fight or they pretend to fight and have these drama-like battles in DC to make it seem like they're trying to get something for us. And in the end, we just get crumbs because it's more important to make sure that the corporate powers get their share first and they will get the lion's share and we will get the crumbs. It is all connected. What MLK is trying to say there and what Glenn Greenwald is trying to show to you is that you have to connect war to poverty at home, not just war to poverty abroad. Yes, when you look at countries like Syria and Afghanistan, yes, the people there are in despair. They are struggling. The U.S. government has put sanctions on Afghanistan, so the people there are starving. Children there are starving. When you look at Syria, you have to look at the part of Syria that the U.S. government chose to occupy. That is the part that has the oil. Even Donald Trump blatantly admitted that. So yes, those people in those countries, they are worse off after U.S. intervention. They are worse off after these economic sanctions. And the economic sanctions don't just affect the soldiers on the battlefield. It affects the civilians as well. And anyone who tells you that it just affects the soldiers on the battlefield, they are lying to you. I want to make that very clear. So that being said, you also have to realize that it affects poverty here at home as well. Recent example, billions and billions and billions of dollars have been given to Ukraine. We have a homeless population in this country that continues to increase. And you don't see the U.S. government trying to put any type of money towards building more homes for people to get people off the streets. You don't see them trying to increase the minimum wage or give the American people a living wage. You don't see them trying to give everybody health care in this country either. The two are connected. And you have to break up one of them. And for me, and this is why I've said this before, this is not something you can vote your way out of. I want to be very clear. Every politician that goes in to that swamp, they either become a part of the swamp or they get kicked out of the swamp. But the people who actually go in with the intention to actually try to fight, they're either co-opted or they're sent packing back home. So when I tell you, you can't just vote your way out of this. You can't. And I don't care who the person is. I don't care if it's Marianne Williamson. I don't care if it's RFK Jr. We're going to talk about him in just a second. I don't care, but whoever it is, if you're going into the two corporate parties, you are not going to be able to fix this electorally. And anyone who tells you that you can is lying to you. We are at a point in this country where we need a general strike, where we need the people to protest in millions like they are in France. That is what we need to happen in this country to really get change for people and to get it quickly. I don't mean 20, 30 years down the road and then we will review it or we'll look at it. We'll send the bill to a study, which is where bills go to die. Let's just be clear. That is what we need. And until the majority, we need 5%. Until we can get 5% of the American population to get on board with that, you are wasting your time sitting here, crossing your fingers and hoping that the next politician that goes into the White House is going to be your savior. You'll be disappointed, just how disappointed I was with people like Barack Obama. I really thought he was going to bring about change. You know how many times I've been through this in my lifetime? You too. Especially those of you who are older than me. I'm pretty sure you've been down this road multiple times. So that piece there by Glenn Greenwald, very important. Please go watch the full video. Powerful MLK speech. War is an enemy of the poor. And that's system update. Now that's the YouTube version. You can see his full videos on Rumble. Very important speech. Please share that speech with other people.